kind of felt quality was the same. It was something which, all of the members of the team could identify with, and it was something which they all agreed with. And also it was something which, pretty much by default, the whole company, both people, let's say, that I was, quote unquote, reporting to, and people below me, like, yeah, of course we want to write good quality stuff. So therefore, that became like the kind of the right angle type of approach in to, this is the motivation. Let's create something that's really good.
Hi there, and welcome to the Working From Home podcast with your host, me, Nelson Jordan. Today, I am delighted to be talking to Luke Szyrmer. Luke, hello.
Hi, Nelson.
How are you doing?
Yeah, good.
So, Luke, tell our audience a little bit about yourself, where you're from, where you are now, and what do you do?
So I am essentially originally from Poland. I lived for a long time in the US, and then I also lived in London for 14 years. So I've been here and there. Professionally speaking, I'm at this point kind of like a manager and consultant. I've managed teams within larger companies, and I consult in terms of new products being launched. And other than that, I'm also an author. So I wrote a book called Launch Tomorrow about 5 years ago. And that kind of kicked off a side business, which became a full-time one at some point. Yeah, that's basically who I am.
Cool. Well, so much we could dig into there. Obviously, you've moved all over the globe and held various jobs at different levels and things. But then to kind of strike out on your own and become an author and start a side business. You've got a lot of things to dig into there. I think we'll start by talking about your moves, if you don't mind. So you said you were originally from Poland and then moved over to the US. What age was that?
Yeah, so I left at the age of 4, 4.5 actually. The situation was my dad went over on a Fulbright scholarship to the US. And when we left, this was in 81, I think roughly 6 months later, martial law was imposed in Poland. So I think we'd only expected to be over for a year. And it was quite complicated to get passports and do all the paperwork and that kind of thing. But yeah, kind of halfway in, it turned out it made no sense to go back. And family was just like, don't. Bad idea.
Yeah.
So I ended up growing up there, going to school, going to college. And after that, I went back to Poland, or now as an adult, for a couple of years. And to see what it was like, because I always heard lots of family stories and that kind of thing. Worked a bit, did another degree, and then moved to London. And there I worked for quite a bit as in various roles in software, basically, for largely kind of a medium-sized software company for the financial sector. And with the last role being like a team manager, development manager.
So within software, then what did you do? Were you kind of on the programming coding side, or?
Yeah, so I started as an implementation guy, became a developer later, and then moved into product, and then at that point moved from product more into just basically managing and delivery and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And owning more and more responsibility, I guess. And with trying to coordinate the work of more and more people so that it's effective.
Mm-hmm. So was that kind of, when you say managing, do you talk about project management, or are you talking about managing people, or a bit of both?
Bit of both, really. I had really good technical people kind of looking more at that angle, and everything else was pretty much on my plate. And I was coming from a technical background, so at least I knew what questions to ask. But I intentionally didn't want to get into the detail of how things are done, because that takes all the fun away for the developers.
Sure.
So
just giving them the environment through your management skills that they can still be creative, they can still implement their solutions that are in their head, rather than telling them what to do.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's what I tried to do pretty much from the beginning. I mean, it's pretty much it was a full-time gig as soon as I realized that. I mean, creating the environment, unblocking them, making sure everybody's clear, making sure the goals are clear, making sure everybody's agreed on what's going on, what needs to happen when. Getting that clarity for everyone, and that's more or less how it looked in practice. And the thing is, I think starting with when I was in more of a development role, at that point, it was already starting to be part of the team in remote offices. So we were still in offices, but kind of working from different locations of that the company had. Mm-hmm. And then, I think at the point where I did start moving more into kind of the management role, I realized, since I had a pretty big team of people who I was coordinating, and I think at the peak it was close to around 30 people, and there was only 2 of us in the London office. A number of people were totally remote. A lot of people were in, I think, 4 or 5 different offices. So we had, let's say, 9 or 10 locations across 13 time zones.
Wow.
And, as a long run kind of effort to build various things. And I realized that, it's totally optional for me to stay in London from a professional perspective. The main reason it was convenient was that the immediate people above me were in London. So from a stakeholder perspective, I think it was good to be in touch with them and that kind of thing. But because I'd already, I had a decent relationship with them from having been with the company for a while, and it was just like, well, since nobody else is in London, and from a personal perspective, it makes sense to be elsewhere. Then why don't we go and do that? And there was another aspect there that my wife got a job offer in Poland. So, and then we were kind of, initially we weren't sure, but then it was like, well, with a small daughter, it makes sense because it's a family around, and it just would make things a lot easier, basically. So we did some prep work, but the actual move was like, we packed up all of our belongings into a van. The guy was weighing it to tell us how much it would cost. So it was 2.3 tons of stuff. Wow. We came initially with 2 suitcases. Mm-hmm. So things just expand, right?
Yeah, as they do.
As they do. And then so the van kind of drove across, and we were chasing after it in our car, basically. So. And it was a mad rush. Ended up roughly 36 hours. We didn't stay the night anywhere on the way.
Wow,
just took the ferry and like kept going and switching out. So fortunately, nothing bad happened.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think a lot of people are kind of realizing that now, when they do manage either wholly remote teams or teams that do have several key components and characters that do work remotely and people that do work remotely. So why do you need to be in one place when everybody you manage isn't there anyway, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
so
exactly.
Something similar, not from a management perspective, but with my wife and I, my job, I realized that I could do it from anywhere. I was actually working for an agency who allowed me to, I'd been working as a full-time employee for them, and I continued working full-time for them, but they allowed me to work from a different country, and then just kind of commute back every month for 2 days and like cram all my meetings in and go again, which was lovely. And then my girlfriend at the time, now wife, was a primary school teacher. So again, one of those jobs that kind of can transfer, and we're lucky enough to speak English, and a lot of other countries want to learn English, want their children to pick that up because it's kind of the business language. So yeah, we're in a very fortunate position there that she had like a skill that could be transferred, and we were kind of in demand, and that kind of opened the door. And it's fantastic to hear that it's done the same for you. So once you did that, did you stay kind of within that environment for a little while from Poland, or what did that kind of situation look like? What was the spur for you to kind of go and all of these projects that we were talking about earlier? So you're writing your book, your multiple businesses and things like that. How did that kind of develop?
Yeah, so it was kind of from an organizational perspective similar to what you had. Also, in that I kind of went in once. I think initially it was once a month, and then it kind of became less and less because we realized it's not quite as needed to go back and visit London and speak with people. And yeah, other than that, I mean, in terms of that transition, I mean, all it kind of meant was that at that point I went freelance, so as a contractor as opposed to an employee, and just kept on doing what I was doing, and then also started taking on, let's say, other clients, and plus I could, within whatever time I could get by, I could go and do more writing or whatever it is that I wanted to do. While still pretty much keeping things ticking along at the old place. So
nice. So when you're kind of, I just want to dig into your expertise a little bit now, if that's okay with you. So sure. When you've obviously got a lot of experience of kind of managing teams remotely, and then obviously that's, as we'll talk about in a minute, kind of you've transitioned into other things because of that as well, which is fantastic. So what kind of things firstly, I would say, what kind of things stop people from having teams that work remotely in the first place? That sort of need to have people face to face. Let's talk about that first.
I mean, I've spoken to various people about this since I started focusing specifically on it. I mean, I think a lot of it's just the staying in the same environment and way of thinking that you are. It's kind of like a inertia of some sort. And I think once you get beyond, the obvious answer like that, I mean, there's things like, you need to start thinking about hiring, which therefore means you have to think about, what the HR aspects are in different jurisdictions, what that would actually look like just purely from a, let's say, mechanical level. And then beyond that, a lot of it's, thinking about, how does having a remote team actually work? Because I think, a really common question when, especially at the beginning of the whole pandemic was like how do we know they're working, right? And that's something which, I heard quite a lot from people who were experienced managers asking me like, okay, you're managing this team, but how do you know they're doing anything? And
what was your answer?
It's like, well, I look at what's delivered. Like, I don't care when they do it. I just, a lot of the work was setting kind of short-term deliverables that, they would then go for. They would either do it or not, but and then it would just be feedback, and based on that, I would know exactly where things were without sitting there watching each person over the shoulder and recording their keystrokes or whatever. That's kind of the short answer, I guess.
So within the deadlines and deliverables and things like that, is that something that you purposely experimented with in terms of like, okay, I wonder what it would be like if I set a 3-day deadline versus next week? Or was it very much just the project dictated that X needed to be done by Y date?
It was something that I was experimenting with, particularly since a lot of the work we were doing was on a larger thing. So yes, there was this overall, let's say, deadline that we had, but then we were working in an agile format, so with sprints, and that in and of itself gave a little bit of a context, and then even within that, we experimented quite a bit. So looking at how long things take. We did all the estimation stuff as per usual, in terms of how big various things are, and then we would look at what we could do and plan out each sprint and that kind of thing. But I was open to experimenting with pretty much everything around that. So we canceled meetings, we added meetings, we had different types of meetings. A lot of it was just about not so much efficiency, but making sure that each person was effective, so that if they were doing something, they were doing something that would contribute to the building of the overall system, right? And there's that partially was just a pure technical thing because it was quite a complicated piece of software, and partially it was this kind of thing. So just having something concrete and clear that you have, like, to break it down into a concrete enough task that this is the next thing I need to do, and then I'll figure out what I need to do after that with the team.
Mm-hmm. So, and this might be something that occurs frequently or not at all, but do you think it's easier to take an existing team and turn it from kind of a face-to-face to a remote thing? Or in your experience, is it more like we need to create a remote team from scratch?
I don't think it's as much of an issue of the team as it is the organizational context. So I think a lot of what managers might pinpoint to say that, the team's like this or like that, or they're not doing this or that kind of thing. I think a lot of that was based on the context in which everything happens. So by that, I mean, things like what the incentives are organizationally, how clear goals are, whether everyone's agreed on those goals, how long that takes, and in the meantime, elapsed time goes, right? Like time, time still happens whether you want it to happen or not. So, so in the context of moving to remote, like I think a lot of the stuff, so I think a lot of the challenge many companies had with the pandemic going into remote is that there's a lot of, let's say, workarounds which are implemented from a management perspective, which can work because we're face to face. Like, you can look at, see if people are at their desks, are they doing stuff, or they, so there are certain types of information which you have a lot more of right away, but it's not necessarily tied to, are they actually being productive, right?
Like, are they there?
Are they there? Yeah. And which is a proxy kind of, but it doesn't actually mean they're doing anything useful other than sitting at their desk. Whereas if you have a clear context and a clear set of goals that you're aiming towards, and then the whole team is aiming towards it. So they're working together, they're supporting each other. If you have that kind of a thing already in place, then moving that online, I think, is going to be a lot easier than being in this kind of traditional kind of top-down hierarchical, or even worse, multi-manager style situation where everybody has their own agendas, and in that context, moving to remote just becomes super complicated, and it just makes it a lot harder. So,
what are the kind of main problems or challenges that you kind of hear from people that they encounter in terms of managing remote teams? What are the big ones?
I think the big one, especially initially, was what I just mentioned. So, like, how do we know they're working? I think in terms of what I'm hearing and speaking to people.
That's super interesting, because I to be honest, and I'm probably I'm obviously a lot further away from this than you are, because I'm a freelancer and I tend to work with other freelancers, and because I understand what they're doing, I know that, like, I'm working, I have to do stuff. I know that they're reliant on doing work to actually make money as well, because they're not salaried employees. But I would have kind of assumed that a large challenge would have been communication. How can you go backwards and forwards, and how you can align people in the same in terms of the same goals, and getting everyone on the same page. But it's interesting to hear that, like, the big thing is, it's something that I kind of just would assume almost as a bit of a given if you were to do remote teams. Like, how do I know they're working? Like, well, if that is your probably biggest thing, then I would be like, maybe managing a remote team isn't for you. I don't know.
Well, it's also, again, this is kind of a company culture thing too. And, if you have teams, the actual execution team separate from the strategy silo, for lack of a better term, then it's kind of then that's kind of the main concern, that that money's being paid to various people, and we want to be sure they're being efficient. But in fact, the efficiency is irrelevant if they're not effective. So that's kind of,
in terms of actually understanding what that looks like on a practical level, then obviously you talked about deliverables. So would that be firstly looking at the deliverables if all of the deadlines have been met per person, but then do you kind of, if they're doing the work, is that something that you'll periodically look at the quality of the work that's done, or do you kind of rely on other metrics or outcomes to measure that?
Yeah, so you bring up a great point. So there's individual work, but actually the only thing that I was focused on was the team output, which included quality as a step, which meant that when we said that something was completed, it already had been fully tested, confirmed. So it's not just built, but we're as much as I could, I tried to not give the team credit for finishing it until it was through quality. I think another part of it was that we tried as much as we could to keep this style of working where the developers would also write automated tests. So before they would even give it to the QA team, they would write tests that would confirm the software does what they think it does. So then they caught bugs at that level before it even got to QA. Then additionally, it was inspected by QA, which didn't know the internals of the code. And therefore, you could finish parts of the system without having the whole system and actually have it be finished with very few expected bugs later, kind of thing. In practice, that was it was part of the daily challenge in terms of actually keeping to that. So it was definitely a good ideal to aim for. And sometimes, we had to spend a bit more time doing a bit more catch up than I would have liked. But, it's just paradoxically, it does end up being faster doing it that way, where you start with quality in mind from the beginning. Mm-hmm. Even though it seems like it's more work, that you've got to write extra tests and you've got to, do all this other stuff, but you don't have any bugs later. So all of a sudden this big unknown time just goes to, next to nothing. So
yeah, exactly. Before you know it, like your deadlines have passed. I'm just trying to think of how we can kind of extrapolate that idea of quality being part of processes outside of software. Obviously, we've got a large audience who won't be involved in kind of software development at all, and I think that idea of having quality as a part of your projects or a part of your management is quite appealing. I'm just wondering how you think, and it might not be, but if you're able to kind of give an example of what that might look like for somebody, say, who is managing an e-commerce brand, for example, and they have a lot of remote workers, whether that's, a remote worker who is involved in customer service, and answering queries. And maybe that's a remote worker who is on the marketing side or things like that.
Oh, before I go to e-commerce, let me try a different one. So there was, so there is a great story of Alcoa, which is an aluminum producer, in a book by Charles Duhigg called The Power of Habit. And I think it's shown up in the news and other places. And basically, the idea there was a new CEO came in and he said, the company wasn't doing very well. The financial numbers were really bad. And then this new guy comes in and he says, I want everyone to focus on safety. The financial analysts were like, what? What are you talking about? And like Wall Street was just completely scratching their head, like, what's going on? And he just kept repeating it, like, worker safety, we've got to be safe. And there was a number of incidents, and each time he kept repeating that this is the first thing. And then once workers realized that he was serious, then he actually cared about it, and it was something which everyone at every level of the organization kind of connected with, then all of a sudden the whole thing just picked up and the company started doing really well. So in my little context of this, this one little remote team, I kind of felt quality was the same. It was something which, all of the members of the team could identify with. They wanted to write good code, create good product, basically. And it was something which they all agreed with. And also it was something which, pretty much by default, the whole company, both people, let's say, that I was, quote unquote, reporting to, and people below me, like, yeah, of course we want to write good quality stuff. So therefore, that became like the kind of the right angle type of approach in to, this is the motivation. Let's create something that's really good. And that's kind of how it worked in that case. So I think to make it, less dependent on those two examples, I mean, I think part of this aspect of building, let's say, alignment and communication, I think is you've got to go and figure out what the kind of common thing that motivates everyone involved is. Mm-hmm. And then
that sounds like an awful lot like the concept of identifying like your North Star. That one thing that is kind of important that brings everybody together to deliver that final product to the final service. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yes, it is. I think that's a good way of putting it. I mean, I think it's important that it's also not something that's done on an individual or in a closed room setting, but literally with as many people as possible. Mm-hmm. And, in a remote setting, that could just mean a lot of one-to-one conversations with various people. But eventually, if you pay attention, you'll pick up cues and see what people are responding to. What are they saying? What do they care about? And then once you get that common thread, and you start communicating almost about everything that you do from the context of that one perspective. So how does this affect quality? Well, okay, well this is going to be later. This is going to be more complicated. How is that going to affect the overall quality of the thing we're going to ship? And
with quality, I guess it could be just to give like a concrete example. It could be this thing is ready. This thing is still a little bit buggy, but we're on a deadline. It will work pretty well, but not perfectly. And then from a quality perspective, you might go, well, actually, like the quality is more important. We're not going to push that live, even though we're getting this pressure to do so. Yeah,
exactly. So for example, let's release less features, but make sure that everything we release is good. And on the other hand, you've got to release something which is usable for customers, because you're not doing it for the team, you're doing it for the customers, right? So,
just to kind of pull out a few more examples as well. So obviously you use the manufacturing example and safety, and then the development example and quality. And then you think of maybe somebody who's famous, like Zappos, for their customer service. And so it's about kind of establishing that. Obviously with the manufacturing example was quite interesting, because it seems clear like the CEO probably didn't talk to everybody in the organization to get that, in terms of directly asking them, what do you think the most important thing is? It seems like it's probably something that he talked to a lot of people and observed and pulled out, okay, this theme keeps coming up. We had X number of days lost last year because of employee injury. We had this line of the manufacturing plant had to be shut down because of that injury, and that cost us X.
Yeah.
Okay, that's really, really interesting. I think that's a good way to kind of develop it, and also to figure out more about your business as well. I think it's got that side effect.
Yeah, exactly. And it's, and it also ties into what actually is important. Like, what are the principles at play? What do you care about? And what does the whole organization care about? And then when you're referencing it, then everybody knows and agrees, and it's kind of a common platform to build everything else from.
No, that makes a lot of sense, I think. I'd like to switch gears for a little minute and just talk about what you're doing now, and why you kind of made that change.
So at the moment, I am writing a book called Align Remotely, and also started a podcast for managers and leaders. I think initially out of wanting to reflect on my own experience and share it with people who, suddenly are managing remote teams, knowing that I have some experience that I can share, both, being on them and then later managing them. So from both sides. So, I mean, at the moment, it's a lot of it is kind of thought and research and speaking with various people. So that's the bulk of it, I think.
That's great. So are you doing that on top of your regular work, or have you kind of taken some time out to make that your main goal?
It's some time out, basically. So until I get that done, I think that that's the one thing.
Yeah.
So.
Not that I want to put the pressure on and hold you to it, hold you accountable at all. I'm definitely not trying to do that. When are you sort of hoping to kind of have the first draft together?
Well, I'd like to have it done by the end of the year. And the podcast is out.
Is that under the same name, Aligning Remotely?
Yeah, Align Remotely. Yeah, it's under the same name. So it's all kind of I felt there was a need to get something that's of value to leaders and companies as I'm working on it, so that So that yeah, that's already happening, and plus it gave little interim deadlines, which is
Yeah.
good.
Which is what you said earlier about managing other people. It helps to manage yourself as well.
Absolutely.
With
Yeah.
the format of the podcast, is that similarly kind of interviews like we're doing, or is that kind of a kind of monologue on a particular topic each week or each episode, I should say?
It is interviews. It's largely at the moment mostly focused on either people whose work I came across and I wanted to speak with them more. So with authors who I just wanted to dig deeper on certain things, or basically people who I knew were doing interesting things related to working remotely, because I spoke with them a lot when I was managing this team, and it really helped me in one form or another.
Kind of like mentors.
Yeah, something like that. And yeah, no, really, honestly, and yeah, I think in particular, I think the aspect of making sure things are interactive, making sure everyone's working together. I think that that's one thing that I'm starting with, and the whole topic of meetings, because I think that for the team, I think that was in a way the hardest, I think, surprisingly. And yeah, getting that piece sorted out. I think once I got that, it made everything a lot easier. So it's in the early days of the pandemic, there was all these articles about 27 different remote work tools you can you can use, and that kind of thing, now that you're working from home and that kind of thing. And yeah, of course, all that stuff is useful, but it's this kind of almost like a surface level need, right? Whereas once you actually get into the human dynamics of the situation, like who are you working with? How is it actually going to work? How are we actually going to do anything?
So it's like the organizational kind of strategic things are more important, whereas like 27 tools are like, to be able to even use those tools well, you firstly have to have done a lot of work before that in deciding like who's going to do that work, what's that work going to look like, what is that process going to look like. Okay, then you can pick the tool that you need for this.
Yeah. I mean, it's both, to be fair, and it's like you've got to learn, look at different tools, figure out what the right thing is, and I'm not saying they aren't important, but it's I mean, they definitely are. Without them, you're kind of stuck. But but now that they're a lot of this technology's been reasonably good since for the last 20 years or so. It's just we've had this a whole set of cultural assumptions around how work is done, which meant that there's Johnny's working remotely from India or whatever it is, and but most people, the real work was done in the office, quote unquote, where now all of a sudden, because we were all forced to re-examine that, it turns out that's a lot of these things which were the sacred cows, so to speak, like they're not true. And on the other hand, you've got to go and explore how does it work? Like, can we still try and organize work in a top-down way? Do we try to give people the ability to interact with each other without kind of monitoring everything they do? Like, is that actually going to help or not? That kind of thing. So,
do you have a framework or a process you use when somebody comes to you and they say, "Look, Luke, my remote team, I don't think this is working"? Where's like the first place that you'd need to kind of look at?
I'm not sure if it's matured as a framework at this point. I think so. Yeah, I think the starting point with all of these is essentially perspective, realigning perspective. So I think a lot of things in the context of a larger company are missed because the the IT team's over here, the developers are over here, QA is over there, marketing is over there, product is over there. They all kind of talk to each other, but they don't really talk much across the department boundaries. And I think being like creating a space where all of that can come together, and you actually look at kind of from an end-to-end process what actually is happening at the moment, to then open up the discussion of how can this be improved. And I think that without, so basically, I don't want to go in and start telling people this or that because they're the expert on how things work within their organization. And a lot of these organizations do have some, fantastic people, have great resources, that kind of thing. But I think a lot of what happens, given that people stay shorter at companies, given that people, even when they are around, like it's there's just a lot of this organizational fabric that isn't there, like it used to be in the 60s, where people would, work until they get their pen for their 30th year anniversary or whatever it was. Like that's not the case anymore. And in terms of actually making things happen, I think it's often, even if you have individual teams working well, it's across the boundaries where things tend to be contentious or missed or dropped or that kind of thing, that's kind of the first place to start if there is a problem.
Maybe that sounds to me kind of like siloed communication, right? That they're good at talking within their own discipline, within their own team members, but then they're not really necessarily either thinking about what's going on externally or to that much degree in a different department. Or if they are, then maybe thinking that it's somebody else's problem. How would you kind of go around countering that, opening up those channels? And as well as that, is it typically that you're trying to encourage one person to lead that who sits above those departments, or is it a case of trying to encourage somebody or multiple stakeholders within each department to try and kind of forge these communications?
You need both, right? You need to do both for it to work. In terms of the practicalities, it's basically kind of more of a workshop format, where you map things out visually as much as you can, and put things in the
when you say map things out, what are those things?
How work is done. How do things get to the customer? I mean, ultimately, it's about existing customers or potential future customers. So mapping out, first of all, what's happening at the moment, and kind of in terms of the process. Across, quite often that's across department boundaries, and if you look at step by step how things actually do work, then you start identifying where there's gaps in people's understanding, and you do it with people from across all of these areas, and both top and bottom, ideally, which then gives you the starting point for that gap analysis, basically, of to then figure out what is the ideal, and before you start there, like what actually is going on, and why are we seeing the following challenges related to delivery or whatever it is. So
okay, so that's interesting. So you think it's about fostering firstly, kind of putting together an overview of what's happening at the moment in terms of how things actually get to a customer, how the work's done, who it's done by, what that kind of actually looks like from a concrete, like literal and visual level. And then establishing both people within different parts of the organization that will have some sort of channels, but also somebody to oversee it and to make sure that they're actually accountable for, at the end of the day, that this person is talking to that person about what was agreed.
I don't think there's as much oversight needed afterwards once you get that initial map done, because if it's done with everyone, they form relationships which aren't there otherwise. And that's part of like the actual mechanics of these silos, right? Like people have close relationships with other people that are exactly like them, people within their own little micro tribe, but they wouldn't even know the first person to ask within marketing, what do we like who is that person? First of all, right? Like who literally, like if I needed to ask someone, do I just like look for people with marketing in their title? Like, it's almost like a cold approach, but it's within a company, right? And ideally, other than the actual knowledge of how things are working, it's about creating the space where the relationships can start to happen and across the company, and then that way you get it just becomes a lot easier to work. It's a lot more fun to work, and and with all of these online tools, it can very much be done remotely. And I know because I did it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, what were you saying about the cold approach actually reminds me of when I was first actually got my first job in marketing. I worked for Hitachi in the UK, but they're obviously a Japanese company, and their headquarters are in Japan. And it was a very similar, like almost cold approach. So if you wanted to be introduced to somebody who is kind of your equivalent, to find out how they're doing in another country, it would technically involve you going to your boss reaching out to the boss of the other headquarters, them putting them in touch with their manager, and then their manager putting them in touch with that person, and then it would reverse and come back. And I'm like, okay, but now once you have that relationship, you can then talk to that person, but you can't go from here to there and just send them an email. Like, not done. So I mean, that stuff existed way before we were doing remote working, and still probably exists today. But no, I just found that quite funny.
And then I mean, because of all of that, like some people will be, some people will feel comfortable just doing the cold approach, but most won't. And then it's no surprise that as a result, you have silos, right? You have geographic ones, you have functional ones, you have, and there's all these little micro tribes, with their own chiefs. And
I think that is about, there's a couple of things there. It's about firstly knowing who to communicate to, or with, I should say. That was very poor English. And also making it as easy as possible to do that, because even if somebody knows that it's easy, that that person exists and they're the one that they have to talk to, if it's hard to do that, then they're not going to do it. So it's about, I guess, creating the cultural norm within the organization that it's an expectation that if you need something from somebody, doesn't matter who they are, that there will be that kind of two-way communication that's expected of you.
Yeah.
No, I like that. Cool. Well, I think that is a fantastic place to leave things. So Luke, obviously you've got a ton of different projects. Where can people find you? What should they kind of expect from your book? And I think you said you're also doing an audiobook version as well.
So all of the information as it comes out is on alignremotely.com, which is at the moment primarily the podcast, but there's links there also for the work in progress for the book and an audiobook. I'm very happy to answer questions. There's contact details for me on there. So if anyone wants to get in touch, please do so.
Fantastic. Yeah, you heard it here, folks. If you want to get in touch with Luke, ask him anything about his experience managing and, being part of that remote working environment, you're struggling with your teams, or you're thinking of setting a new one up, please get in touch with him. And that's it for today, and we'll speak with you next week. And that's it for today. You've been listening to the Working From Home podcast with me, Nelson Jordan. We've been talking about the good, the bad, and the ugly side of remote work. Thanks so much for listening, and I really hope you've enjoyed the time you've spent with us today. If you'd like to discuss the podcast, you want to make a new friend, or you're interested in working with me on a copywriting or digital marketing project, then visit nelson-jordan.com. That's nelson-jordan.com, where you can also sign up to my newsletter to hear about this podcast and other exciting projects. Until next week, goodbye.